Because if in this time of so much, chaos and confusion and just being overwhelmed by all this data, even if you want to just talk about the amount of books that are out there about practice that, people read, and it just confuses them and confuses them into thinking they know something, as opposed to, how about you just have an experience without inundating yourself with more data? Because if you have an experience and you have a sense of clarity, then from there you may be able to see things more clearly. And from there you may be able to see if, not how, but if you should move or not. And so seated meditation for me is probably the most pivotal practice that I try to get my students to engage in, because you're literally just sitting there with yourself. There's nothing to run away from. There's nothing to distract you. Everything you face in seated meditation is just you. You can point fingers, but as my Kung Fu brother Dawei says, you point one finger at somebody, you're pointing three back at yourself, And so if we sit in all of this chaos, and then we actually end up having a true and real experience, then perhaps we can sort of step away from all of the data that we're confused by, all of these kind of ideological views that we have, that we sort of use to support and prop ourselves up. And instead we can just lean into the most basic aspect of being human, which is to be in relationship,
So that dimension of adaptability in the
Mm-hmm.
relationship between you and your students, has that been stretched and diversified in recent times more than before?
Yeah, it's a great question. Because in coming to the West and teaching, or really in any context, it's sort of, we don't have a specific way you should be a teacher or a way you should relate to your students, because it's not about a relationship. It's not about a transaction. It's about a connection that's happening, and a real connection, one where, for example, as a teacher, I'm gonna challenge you. And yet at the same time, I'm going to feel like a person that you're comfortable with. And so, all the relationships are going to be unique between a teacher and a student. Something that's been interesting for me to witness during this time of the pandemic is people are really noticing just how important their communities really are. When I first, all of my contract work that I do canceled on me on the same day in the middle of March last year. And I said, oh, okay, now I get a break, and my in-class students, we all decided like, hey, now's not the time. But over time, people kind of were messaging me being like, hey, I live in Oakland and I have a 1-bedroom apartment and I work from home and I can't go anywhere and I miss you guys. I miss class. And so what ended up happening that I noticed in this kind of collapsing of yang, this kind of yang exaltation and this sort of enslavement of yin, this collapse kind of forced people into a very yin space, forced people into a very reflective space. And that went one of two directions, made people very aggro, or it made people realize, oh, wow, I needed a rest, or I needed to sort of bring my attention to myself in a different way. And so one thing that I've noticed about this time as a teacher is that people, it seems like, and Giles, you've shared the same thing with me, is that it seems like a time, I think you said, where people are finding that mind-body practice is becoming like, it's like, oh, this is really important. I've taught a few different seated meditation courses during the pandemic, and I'm probably going to be doing another one in April or so. And one of the things that I've found in how I engage in those practices, and again, just sharing my experience with it, is the responsiveness to it is resounding. And part of it is not just because of the practice. Yes, of course, because of the practice. But another part of it is because there's a sense of community. Even though those meditation courses that I taught were online. People are practicing on their own. We meet once a week, and there's a feeling of a kind of a cohesive quality there. So in the Taoist tradition, we have what's called Sambao, the 3 treasures, right? The Buddhist tradition also has 3 treasures. And You have the Dao itself, and then you have the Jing, which is the scriptures or the teachings. And then you have the Si. Si is like the Si of Sifu, which means teacher. But in that way, we can also think of Si as in Sixiong or Sidi, which means Kung Fu brother, right? And so there's kind of this poignant piece there about relationship and how important it is. And what I've discovered in, I have some personal students that I teach here in person in Santa Cruz, and it's a very small group, and all of them are very, very, very dedicated people. And one of the things that they've come to realize during this time is not only the importance of a real engaging practice that goes beyond a sort of, pardon the phrase, but as my friend Lucas likes to say, transcendental masturbation, a practice that really brings you into being with things as they are, right? Because to me, that's one of the best ways of defining a meditation practice is being with things as they are without any artifice or contrivance. And beyond that is having a community of other real people who are doing that, who truly, truly care about each other. When I first came back, or when my master, when he first went to America the first time, 2009, 2010 in the winter for a couple weeks, and he came back, and I had stayed over our break, and he came back and he looked frazzled. He just looked like, he'd seen a ghost. And he told me, he said, when you go back to America, most important thing you have to do when you open a school is make a community. He said, there's no community in your country. And he called it san li, meaning insides. So the three insides. You're at home, you get in your car, you go to your job, you get back in your car, and then you go back home. He said, you have to make a community. And I was having a small get together with some of my students a few weeks ago for Christmas. And I told them, I said, all of you are very dedicated, very small group of people. You're very dedicated to the practice, and you never miss class. You treat me well as your teacher, and you treat each other well. And I said, and I told them that story about my master. And I said, my master told me I had to make community. But to me, I think maybe I went a step beyond that and made family, because it's a time, man, people feel so isolated. People felt isolated before this. I remember when I lived in London, you're surrounded by thousands of people all the time, but everybody, headphones, it's like everybody's got one of those like astronaut helmets on, just kind of floating through space, surrounded by ghosts of other humans. This is not human to me, to be so isolated.
So could you set the scene for California in late 2020, January 2021? What are the current COVID-related restrictions in play? Are you allowed to train as a group physically? Are you allowed, do you have to isolate at home? What is it? What's the situation in California?
Well, as it seems everywhere, everybody pretends they know what's going on. Every day it's something new. You have to wear this mask today. And it's like, okay, sure, I can adapt. It doesn't matter to me. Right now, we can practice outdoors. What we're kind of hearing, or what I'm kind of hearing, is that actually outdoors around a bunch of people is better than indoors around a few people. Yeah. So all of my classes right now that are with my personal group are outdoors. The teaching that I do at a retirement community in another city close by, we're outdoors. In the addiction outpatient center, we're indoors, but there's only a couple people in the room, big spacing. So there's limitation with the mask when we're indoors because we're breathing.
Yeah, sure. And do you have to refrain from physically adjusting posture, showing applications and things like that? Do you have to keep away from people?
Yeah, in the work that I do in my contracts, I don't do any of that stuff. Yeah. I would do some posture adjustment stuff, but people right now, many people are very scared. And so my goal as a teacher is to kind of find a common ground where an open conversation can happen, where we step away from the kind of the overwhelming stuff and talk in a way where we can meet each other where we need to be met. And with my personal students, you know, we, I know, I mean, we're a really small bubble of people, between, I'll have between 3 and 6 people in class right now. And I'll make little adjustments here and there. We'll go over application stuff and whatnot. But most of the teaching that I'm doing with them is, stillness-based practice, a lot of standing, and then a lot of Tai Chi and whatnot. So if it's, for some of them doing faster forms and whatnot, I'll show an application, or,
Mm.
if we're standing, I'll come over and adjust
Yeah,
posture. And it's just kind of all of us in that regard. It's kind of like, look, we accept that we don't know.
yeah,
And if I'm adaptable, you know what I mean? I'm
yeah,
quite adaptable. But when it comes to the context of that small class, I don't let new people join right now.
yeah,
If I do have new people interested, I'll do something completely different, in a
yeah,
different class where I'm not doing any of that stuff. And so it's really, I mean, Giles, you remember the course that I did back in April. It's
mhm,
navigating uncertainty. And the funny thing is like, it's not just now. We're doing that all the time.
mm,
It's
mm.
just the illusion of certainty, that a plane isn't going to crash through my roof in 2 minutes. Hopefully.
So, and at any point in the last 12 months, have there been stricter conditions of people being literally been quarantined at home for any periods of time?
Yeah, especially in the beginning.
Right.
And for me, like I said, I quite enjoyed it because I
Yeah.
just got to be a little hermit in my home, and I would get in my car once a week to go get groceries, and then I'd just be sitting here reading books. And
Yeah.
yeah,
We're more of that in that
yeah,
phase in the
yeah,
UK. And I know you've often talked about the embodied dimension to Taoist practice.
right,
And I'm also thinking about that embodied aspect of community as well.
yeah, yeah,
And, remembering the times when I was training with you in London,
hmm,
I would often be after a really long day at work.
yeah,
And then the actual physicality of us meeting together,
yeah,
training hard, and maybe
right,
eating too, that kind of stuff.
yeah,
That was a really key aspect.
yeah,
And um, that's something that I'm noticing the
hmm,
absence of. And also
hmm,
then to teach my own students
hmm,
in the UK, we've had since September, we've had phases when we can meet together outdoors,
yeah, yeah,
we can meet together indoors. Then we were back in our homes for a month, and then
hmm,
we had a reprieve for a month, and then we're
hmm,
back indoors. A lot of confusing policy and inconsistent policy, but
right,
it meant
right.
there was this coming and going of
That's right.
my embodied community. And I really, it's definitely a different quality online and things. And I'm
Yeah,
wondering
yeah,
if you've noticed those kind of ebbs and flows of physical presence of students versus virtual
yeah,
presences.
yeah. I am not a fan of doing things online. And yet, with that being said, it's like we have to adapt.
Yeah,
Um, I've been quite slow to getting things moving online. I'm starting to do a bit more now. I always, because it, to think that communication is simply I talk, you listen, you talk, I listen. Nah, man. There's so much more subtlety to that. Down to smell, down to posturing, down to feeling a difference in how someone's posture. Whether or not we can say on an extremely very clearly conscious level we're noticing that, it doesn't really matter.
mm,